I'm interested in this issue of social purpose within your fund. How do you instill that sort of sense of social purpose in your investee companies?
Well, I think, Joe, look, we only invest if we believe in the company and if we believe in the management. And so generally we spend time with them before we invest to understand if we're aligned, and we will agree a business plan so that there is that deep alignment. So it's not up to us to instill it. It's actually got to be in the management. And generally people want to do that, right? But if we think that they're not interested in the long-term future of the business or the employees, we're probably not going to invest.
Yeah. And so what's your sense then of the importance of the public good in your investee companies? If we look, for example, even today at the care economy and what's happening in childcare and what we're seeing in the NDIS, is it difficult to, as a company seeking to make money and generate profit for your investors, and managing that with the huge, what we see, the social contract in companies these days?
I mean, there's always been a social contract there, and I think that those that have understood that in the long term have done better than others. And I think, people want to work for companies where they are doing the right thing. Coles came to us back in 2010 and said, we want to do something about our food. And when Coles partnered with Second Bite, they had the biggest increase in staff engagement they'd ever had. So the benefits to companies of doing the right thing and being seen to do the right thing is profound. And so where we can, we hope to align those principles.
Yeah. I was interested to see Michael Phillips' recent article about the Tanarra Australian Recovery Fund, I think your second fund in this area. What sort of characteristics are you looking for in your investee companies there? That seems well balanced against what the global managers are doing in this space.
So what we look for, Joe, is one, we look for businesses which have got a future, okay? So generally we're looking for businesses in an industry which we think is growing, okay? We're not looking to go into an end-of-life industry, and I can give you an example in the past of, book retailers or retailers where the industry is changing, consumers are changing. So we look for something which is growing. A couple of our great investments, and I'll give you an example because they're public knowledge, is DeLorean, which is an ASX listed company, and they make waste to energy plants. So for us, we like the management. We think that the industry is growing. It's actually really good from an environmental point of view. So that's one of our great investments. So if we can find ones where we think growth, good management, good culture, then that's what we're looking for.
I was really interested to see your release of short-form modernised corporate governance principles. Very interested in the sort of the practical approach you're taking in there to governance, so getting away from prescriptive ideas around how boards should be formed, with the principle being that the investors know best. You just want to talk about the genesis of all of that for me?
Well, that's something that John Wiley is very strong on, having invested in public companies. And so one of the Tanarra funds is a long-term value fund, and it invests in public companies. And so in looking at those public companies and in looking at the governance, the Tanarra team, driven by John particularly, has said, what are the principles? And he's talked about one of his big things is that directors should have an investment in the company. So they've actually got some skin in the game.
Indeed.
And so this concept of people being very actively involved, understanding the business, skin in the game, walking the floor, rather than just being separate independent directors who a bit standoffish to the company.
And so your sense is then it's really about picking the right people, getting away from ideas of intersectionality and the necessary diversity on boards into we pick the right people for the right jobs. They've got skin in the game. They're heavily involved. And these are the kind of people who will understand those investments best.
Yeah, look, I think, I wouldn't completely differentiate from diversity because, when on the second bite board we had more women than men, and the women think differently. And so they allow us to see things that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise see. So my personal view is we sit down with a skills matrix for what we need for the company. What does the company need? Has it got someone who's been in the industry that deeply understands, manufacturing or retailing, those fundamental skills? Have we got someone who understands, government? If we're dealing with the government a lot, do we really understand how governments act? So I'm about what are the skills the company needs, and then make sure that we've got some diversity in the board.
This sort of philosophy at Tanarra, is it resulting in really high levels of conviction in your people? Do you think it's improving the quality of your people, just being exposed to this sort of philosophy that you and John and others are, promoting?
Look, I think people, we probably have 5 or 6 interns at any one time, and there are so many people who want to work at Tanarra, but I think there's a lot of people who also want to work in funds management. But generally, people want to work at places where they're going to learn, from people, and be in an industry where they can grow. So I think they're the fundamental principles of where people want to work.
I mean, we're talking outside about, foundational issues, my background and yours and the people I was brought up by. I think that's critically important that we have the right kind of behaviours at the top of these companies.
100%.
Yeah.
And, for my part, I always admired KPMG because I saw that way they brought the next generation on. It was the David Crawfords who brought Lindsay Maxted on, and then Lindsay brought on your generation. So I think that's a fundamental thing about bringing people on, about letting them grow and passing the baton.
One of the interesting things we're seeing is, and I don't like to use the word activist, but the kind of correspondence and communications you're raising with some of your governance investee companies, Lend-Lease and other things, that's very noteworthy, but relatively new in Australia.
Look, I'm not an expert, but it's I think it's newer in Australia. Now, what Tanarra and John would say is that long-term value fund, it's a constructive activist fund. It doesn't seek to go out and embarrass a company. It sits down initially with the board and talks to them about the strategy and how they think the strategy can be improved. So they see themselves as constructive activists rather than like some of the US funds, which can be much more aggressive.
What would, Ian, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot about Tanarra from this and preparing for this podcast. So thank you. What would your general call to action be for the sort of companies you invest in and government's role in improving our economy generally?
That's a big question, Joe.
It is. That's why I'm asking you.
So, look, I think we break it up into 2 parts. For the companies that we're dealing with, we want them to be lean. We want them to work together and be looking at changes in society. And for governments, I think the issue with governments is to stay out. We want to be careful we don't over-regulate companies so that they can't make profits. And I think that's the big risk in Australia at the moment, is that it's hard to do business, and we've got to make it easy to do business. And we've got to remember that it's companies which create the jobs, which pay the taxes.